Hello, it's good to be back with you for episode 3 of In Conversation, where Jess and I just have a conversation about a particular subject, sharing something of our faith and some of the things that we're passionate about in life and in ministry. The last couple of weeks we've been thinking about church, and today we want to think about church in particular. And the reason why we want to think about what is church is for probably everyone's life, church has consisted of going to a building to do something. And you may have interacted with community activities and things like that, but it always kind of probably centred around the image of a building. And certainly in the history of Bramwell Parish Church, I don't know about St Mary's, St Luke's or St Thomas's, but it's the first time in our history that our building has been forcibly shut and people haven't been allowed to gather there. I'd say that probably for nearly every cathedral and parish church in the country, that's the case, although the parish churches have been closed in England before, but I can't remember when. You need to speak to the vicar of Oxton on the Wirral about that. But it was to do with a falling out with the Pope, and the Pope basically shut all the English parish churches. But that's quite a long time ago. So most people would acquaint church with the idea of a building. And certainly in the last few months, there's been big statements about the church is not closed, except the building is. So what actually is the church? And I've got a quote here that I read in a book which is entitled Why Bother with Church? And it says this: it's easy to think of a church as being a meeting place for those whose hobbies happen to be God. On the surface, my church is a lot like an old tennis club. People meeting together because of a shared interest, running occasional events to raise the profile in the wider community, trying to drum up new members, having meetings with minutes and secretaries and getting caught up in the minutiae of all to a degree that would baffle most outsiders. There's also a lot of serving, but scratch under the surface and there's a lot more going on. So we just kind of want to think, well, if church isn't the building, what is the church? What do you think, Jess?
I think we read in scripture, don't we, that the church is the people of God. So no matter where we meet or how we meet, the church is actually about the people of God coming together in some form of gathering, whether that be small or big, whether that be inside or outside. And I think there's something about what the people of God do in order to be the church. I think, there is something about worship, praise of God. There is something about the service of God's people and the community in which we're set as well. So it's been really great for me, even though it's been a strange time to start a new job. It's been really great for me to still be able to get stuck into some church activities in Stockport. And I think one of the really big things for me, and one of the reasons why I chose to take the job on at Stockport, is that the church doesn't need the building in order to be the church. The church needs to be out in the world, in the places where it's set, to proclaim the love of God through acts of service. And so one of the things I've been heavily involved with in the last couple of months is buying and then sending on food parcels to our local schools to feed those families, particularly during the summer holidays, who would have otherwise been fed at school. And there's something about church in that, I think.
Yeah, so we're looking at the book of Ephesians in our evening service on a Sunday, and this week we're looking at Ephesians chapter 2, which says that we, by the grace of God, we are bound together as members of the household of God, and we are growing into his likeness through that. And so people might use the word, the noun church, to describe a heap of stones that have been put together in an ordered fashion in which people can gather. But Jesus was quite clear, the church is not the building, because the building can be dismantled and got rid of and desecrated and all of that. Jesus says that we are the church. He says, when 2 or 3 gather together in my name, there I am in the midst of them. He says that we are the light of the world. He says it's the people who are the church. And the reason why that's different, he says, Jesus said, on Peter, on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not be able to prevail against it. Bombs can fall on churches, bad trees can fall on churches, they can be knocked down, they can be got rid of, they can be flattened or whatever. And so the building ceases to be a church. But Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, which means it has to be more than its building, because it cannot be destroyed.
And it's interesting how in a relatively short space of time we've been caught up in the church being a building. I was on our holiday in Malta last year reading a book called Phoebe, which is the fictional reimagining, if you like, of the story of Phoebe and the early church. And it really struck me of the image of the church in that time, that actually they met in people's homes, that they began as small gatherings but then grew into much larger gatherings, with people often standing outside just to hear the teaching that was taking place, that they would often have a meal together, and that they would share all that they had in common, which is what we hear about in the book of Acts, isn't it? That actually church is much more like, as we were talking last week, a family, in that everything comes under the one roof and is shared. And it's not in this great big colossal building that we place all our pride on, but actually it's in something a lot more intimate.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we've learned at St Michael's about church, and I know there's maybe one or two people that have struggled to understand it, certainly in our church, but we've moved from this idea of gathering together on a Sunday and we make sure everybody's okay on that Sunday, to actually phoning people throughout the week during lockdown, which is what we were doing, and checking on people, and people going, well, why are you calling me? Saying, well, it's part of our duty as the church to care for one another, to support one another. And so the church was still alive through that intentional, intimate communication. The church was still alive in its social action through helping the food bank and caring for those people in need. I know lots of other places have been creating meals for people and driving people to appointments and things like that. And so we move from this idea of the church being an unchangeable feature to actually the church being alive, doing all sorts of different things, which is about care, it's about relationship, and as we said last week, it's about hospitality.
Definitely. And I'm just reading something that Sam Wells, vicar of St Martin in the Fields in Trafalgar Square, he writes that the church is not something that anybody particularly owns, but is something that is entrusted to us, and is something which we should seek to pass on to the next generation as something which is stronger, richer, finer, worthier than they inherited it. Which I guess is a call for all of us as Christians, as the church gathered in our local community, that we are to pass on the faith of Jesus Christ to those in the next generation and beyond in a way that is richer, finer and worthier than we inherited it.
So if you take that idea of the church being an inheritance that's passed from one generation to the next, we have in the last 6 months, let's say 6 months, seen the biggest change in the church for a generation, if not more. What are we handing on to the next generation? I was in a meeting this morning where we were talking about some of the changes that are happening at St Michael's, and I said let's try and turn a positive spin on it rather than a negative spin, and say, well, maybe God is refining his church. To use that Old Testament image, we're refining the harvest and getting rid of the dross, so that actually the pure and good and holy bits of the church are left, so that God's kingdom can grow more effectively in the future. Because actually, any community, any organisation, any building can get so caught up in what it's doing week in, week out, making sure that the machine is working, that it doesn't ever kind of go, well, should we be doing that anymore? I think of a big factory with a production line. Those people that are managing the production line are keeping the production line going. It requires an external person to go, well, actually, we could make that more efficient, or we could change that machine to do this. So have you noticed any changes in the church that you think are appearing or have appeared or might appear in the months ahead?
Well, just to pick up on something you just said first, it's interesting, isn't it, that we've got caught up in a particular way of doing things, and we often hear it said, or we ourselves are perhaps guilty of saying it, but why do we do things? Well, this is the way we've always done them. And I was having a conversation with somebody this week who was challenging that almost. Somebody had come into our church and people said, well, that isn't really what we're about. This isn't the kind of place for them. And actually they challenged that and said, actually, this is exactly what we're about. It was actually welcoming somebody who would probably be considered an outsider in every other area of society, and the church is the place where that person should be made to feel welcome and included. And so it's about almost challenging those old ways of doing things, not completely getting rid of them, because they've stood the test of time. So there's got to be something that we learn from them and must keep from them as well. But actually that there are, as you say, new things that God is speaking to us about and teaching us. And there's something in that about not taking for granted those things that we had before, and not dismissing them as unimportant. I think I personally have been guilty of taking the fact that we could meet together every week, and that we could do so in close proximity to one another, that we could sing, there's things like that actually I would want to say the church isn't the church without. I remember when we were thinking about reopening, I said, well, if we can't have coffee and we can't sing, what's the point? And there's something perhaps a bit trivial about that, and perhaps dilutes the church down to nothing. But equally, there is something important in those things, in our coming together, that I think we kind of haven't valued in the way we perhaps should.
Yeah, Justin Welby once wrote, "The church is capable of inspiring solidarity in our society when it engages it in a way that highlights the positive impact that a commitment to the community can have." It's quite wordy, but what he's saying is actually the church still has the power to inspire other people in that standing with others through all the changing scenes of life. To steal that line from a hymn, the doorbell went just as I predicted it would. We're just going to ignore that. Sorry if you're the one that was at the door. And that's still a task for us today. I remember having a conversation with someone not so long ago as we were preparing to open, who was lamenting the fact that families don't come to church anymore and we will never get them coming back. And I just don't believe them, because I think the church has an incredible opportunity now, being the people of God, to inspire others to share in the love of God. I'm going to go and answer that. You keep talking.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you actually that we will get them back. It's been really interesting. I was writing something this week. Tear Fund during lockdown did a project to see who and how people were engaging with faith as the church was closed, and it saw an increase in people who were praying, who were tapping into online worship. And what was particularly interesting about that was that of those people, a large proportion of them were between the ages of 18 to 34, and also another large proportion of them were people who admitted to never having been inside a church before or engaged with the church in perhaps its formal setting pre-lockdown. And that got me really excited when I read that, because I thought it's a huge opportunity for us to think about what can our churches look like, what can our gatherings look like, to include those people that we've been reaching out to in a new and fresh way. How can we bring them into our community of faith in a way that isn't saying, this is what we do, you come on our terms or you don't come at all, but actually, as we were saying last week, come as you are, let us learn from you, and let us do things in a new way as the Spirit moves us to incorporate those people. And he's back.
Sorry, it was a sides person. The joys of living in the vicarage and not being in the garden.
I was just talking about the research that Tear Fund did about there being an increase in the people who were praying during lockdown and those engaging with online worship, and how they were particularly younger people. And so I was just agreeing with what you were saying about we have a huge opportunity to welcome families and younger people who perhaps we aren't reaching at the moment, and talking about how we might do that.
Yeah, and so for me, I guess we've been talking 15 minutes now, so we might have to start bringing it to a close. But the church, I believe, and I would say this, but I take my dog collar off, and I would believe it's one of the most important organisations in the world, and because it's not an organisation that exists for a particular set of aims or values, but it exists for people, because it is about people. An archbishop once said that the church is the only organisation that exists for its non-members. We exist as the church to share the good news of Jesus with those that aren't yet part of our family of faith. And how we do that, traditionally, I guess, has been tied up with worship in our buildings. And something of the excitement, if you want to call it excitement, of the lockdown has been, well, we have to do that differently. We have to engage with it outside of a building and do it in a more creative sense. And surprisingly, people have rocked up and listened. People have got engaged. And that hasn't transformed into bums on seats yet, but there are still people engaging and asking questions. And Jesus said, I'll come back to it, that on this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. The gates of coronavirus will not prevail against it. And I think that the future is full of hope for God's church, because I don't think he's finished with us yet. And I think our duty is to remember that the church is about people, that we're called to be the bride of Christ, following him and listening to his instructions, his commands, and seeking to share something of who he is and his love for us with the people that aren't yet part of our community. And I think when we take that formal institution thing off of us and out the way, we begin to see the reality and the true marks for church, which for me were transformative as a person.
Yeah, definitely. I think if we can end with a quote that perhaps wraps us up. It says, "It's impossible to be in Christ and not belong to others. A Christian by definition has a connection with and a responsibility to other Christians. You cannot claim Christ and avoid his people. If God is your father, then his people are your family, and you are to treat your family as your father wants you to. Church is therefore not a meeting you attend, but a body you belong to."
Great, thank you, Jess. That quote is the inspiration for what we're going to be talking about next week, actually. And we're going to be talking about church as a duty, because I came across that quote a couple of weeks ago and was just stunned by it. So if you want to learn more about that quote, or if you can't remember what we said and you're interested, tune in next week, where we're going to be thinking about church as duty. I hope our ramblings have made sense. Sorry that I disappeared. And you will see us, but obviously we won't see you. Thanks for listening, for joining us, and episode 4 next week. Take care.
Bye.